Okay, so I guess it's 10 o'clock, so we can probably start. I'm really excited to have Kathryn give a keynote today, so I'll just do a tiny introduction. Kathryn is the co-director of the Design Bioethics Lab at the University of Oxford, which is an interdisciplinary research group that develops tools for analyzing morally complex and divisive issues. She also holds a joint appointment at the Hero Oxford Institute within the Philosophical Moral Psychology Lab. So her work sits at the intersection of moral psychology, bioethics, and social cognition, and she has a focus on how innovative methods can generate new insights into these areas. I hope that was accurate
That
enough.
was great. Thank you.
So I guess I'll just pass on to you, and yeah, excited to see you present.
Yeah, great. Thank you. And thanks so much for inviting me to talk. I think that this initiative is really exciting. So it's a pleasure to speak at I think it's your first conference, right? Which is really cool. Um, I'm going to talk about two things. I'm going to briefly talk about my background and sort of my experience as a student. It was hard for me to sort of condense that into a short enough time, but I've picked out some key things that I really took away from me for my undergraduate degree. And then I'm going to zoom in on some of my research. And again, it was hard to pick just one component of this. So you'll notice that in my talk side, I've scratched out games because I'm going to focus more on virtual reality today, but you'll see how it relates to games, I think, as I'm talking through the presentation. Um, so, just to give you an idea of what I'm going to talk about, so as I said, a little brief sort of overview of my academic journey, which is not a typical one. Then I'll zoom in on this particular area of research I've been doing, sort of innovating research methods in moral psychology. So I'll start by talking about sacrificial dilemmas and the role they play in moral psychological research. Then I'll talk about how I think virtual reality has innovated the field, or at least provided us with new ways of measuring interesting things in moral psychology. And as part of that, I'll show you some of the studies that I've done using virtual reality and some of the surprising things we found. And then I'll start to sort of unpick what I think virtual reality is telling us about moral judgment and action. So that's the plan. And I'll leave plenty of time for questions at the end as well. So my academic journey then. So Sinead's already done an amazing job of introducing my role and what I actually do. So at the moment, I'm a co-director of an interdisciplinary research lab, and we're called the Design Bioethics Lab. The way that we think about, or the way that we've conceptualized design bioethics, is building purpose-built tools to study bioethical issues. So that basically means morally relevant issues. And we focus on issues that affect young people in particular. That's what my lab's really focused on, or what it's really interested in. And we're part of a bigger research team called which is neuroethics and society. This is us. We're all friendly bunch. And within the team, there's a huge array of different disciplinary backgrounds. So I think I'm one of two moral psychologists. There's geographers in the team, psychiatrists, clinical psychologists, computer scientists, game designers, many others. So it's a really lovely sort of mixture of different backgrounds. And as Sinead said, I'm also a senior researcher in the Hero Oxford Institute, which, is based predominantly in sort of philosophy, but where we also do sort of empirical research as well. But I'm also a normal person. So these are my dogs, who I love very much. Just to humanize the academic life. But my university experience, and it's always interesting to talk about different people's university experiences. When I was at college, so in the UK, what you tend to do after you've done sort of your typical sort of schooling system, is you go to sixth form college and you do A levels, and those A levels allow you to get into university. And when I did my A levels, I actually took mainly humanities-based subjects, so I didn't really do much science. I was really passionate about English literature and English language and linguistics, but I was helping friends study for their psychology exams. And I thought, what is this amazing subject that studies human behavior in the brain? And they were reading papers that had been published that year, and I just thought it was so exciting. So I just took a massive risk, and I just took psychology at university without having studied it before. It was the best decision I ever made. And I did my BSc in psychology at Bangor University. You could see me there in the middle throwing my hat to the sky. Um, and I actually ended up staying at Bangor. I really liked the atmosphere there, and I liked the location, mountains and the sea. So it was kind of wonderful. But when I did my master's degree, I decided to really focus in on research methods because I found early on that I really liked thinking about how we can operationalize different constructs in moral psychology, and come up with valid and reliable, interesting ways of studying them. And the second photo, you can see I made a few more friends during the master's degree. And then I went on to do my PhD. And at that wasn't immediately, so I had a little bit of time out. And actually, I was offered a job in London as a data analyst at the same time as being offered my PhD. I'm really glad I took the PhD in the end. Life probably would have looked very different. But my PhD was in experimental moral psychology, and you can see me there wearing one of the funny hats. But in terms of my actual university experience, I was really thinking about the things that shaped my career now, and the things that I was really glad that I leaned into. And that's really what I wanted to share with you all today. So I think I've already mentioned methods a million times, but my both of my undergraduate degrees were really methods focused. So there was a lot of emphasis on quantitative and qualitative methods and analyses. And for me, that was really advantageous because it supported my PhD research. And my thesis ended up being sort of part methodological innovation and part theoretical advancement. So it really helped with that component of my PhD research. But I think probably more importantly, it supported my interdisciplinary career. So those skills are certainly things that allow you to work in these very sort of mixed environments, the type of position that I work in now. And then personally, understanding different methods, understanding different approaches made me excited to try new tools and approaches, and gave me the skills to confidently validate those and use them in different projects. So I think that's one of the best things about doing a psychology degree, I think, is that you get this really strong methods training. And as part of both degrees, I had sort of formalized opportunities for research placements, which was really, really fortunate. But I also did a lot of research volunteering during my undergraduate and my master's degrees. And I'd encourage anyone who is really passionate about research and being involved in research projects to just reach out to academics because they're usually very excited and willing to give you opportunities. And I did that often, and it really paid off. And for me, and maybe there's lots of people who are in the same sort of situation, it was really hard to decide which area of psychology I liked the most because I kind of liked all of them. And I liked all the different methods across all the different types. And it felt a little bit strange to me to kind of pocket social psychology separately to cognitive psychology. And so I ended up choosing a domain where I got to use all of the things at once. So all the different methods and approaches. And I'm definitely really glad I chose to do that. So that's why I ended up specializing in moral psychology. So that's a little bit about me and my background, and hopefully it's helpful. But what I'll do now, in the interest of time, is I'll just quickly skip over this slide. This just sort of shows you all the different places that I've lived in the UK and all the different positions I've had. It's always fun to move around and get different experiences. But I'll zoom into the talk now, because this is the thing that I'm most excited about. So I thought I would talk to you about the role that different methods have played in my research in moral psychology in particular. But I recognize that there'll be lots of people in the audience who don't necessarily know what moral psychology is. So be patient with me if you do. But this is a whistle-stop tour introduction to moral psychology. So the interesting thing about moral psychology is that it was kind of created or born from two neighboring streams of research in psychology and philosophy. So it's the study of human thought and behavior in ethical context, but it's a hybrid inquiry. So it's informed by ethical theory and sort of psychological empirical research. So if you're someone who likes interdisciplinary research, it's the field to go into. So within psychology itself, we adopt research methods and approaches, theoretical frameworks from cognitive, social, personality, developmental, and evolutionary psychology. And that's just, I mean, there's more than that. But also, a lot of the things that we touch on go beyond psychology and the subfields within psychology. So, obviously, it draws heavily from philosophy, but also criminology, sociology, anthropology and neuroscience, even psychopharmacology. And I now work in a psychiatry department. So it really is this really interesting interdisciplinary field. But when you think about the concept of morality, if I were to ask each of you what it means to be a moral person or what it means to do something moral, what it means to do something immoral, there's probably a lot of different things we agree on. But there's also going to be individual differences between us. There's going to be differences based on our upbringings, based on where we're based in the world. And so when you think about how complex and multifaceted that concept is, it then becomes a challenge as a psychologist because we're interested in measuring stuff. And in order to measure things, we have to be able to define them and operationalize them. And I think the way that moral psychology is typically handled or typically tackled that complex problem is to break morality down into component parts. And so the sort of two key component parts that I've been interested in and that I spend a lot of time researching are moral judgment. So how do people decide what's right and what's wrong? But as a psychologist, I'm not necessarily only interested in what people think is right and wrong. I'm also interested in what they actually do in light of those moral judgments. And obviously, emotion and motivation play a role in that picture as well. And it's important to acknowledge that. And my PhD thesis was actually focused on the relationship between these two things. So, the kind of the whether we can predict action from judgment. And I'll talk more about that in a moment. So then once we've kind of got these parts that we've operationalized, we then have to think about how to measure them. So if I want to look at moral judgments, I need to put people in a situation where they're deciding what's right and what's wrong and what's good and what's bad. And the way that we've typically done that in this field is to use moral dilemmas. So hopefully everyone's familiar with the concept of a moral dilemma. It's called a dilemma because there's a conflict between two moral requirements. So you have moral reasons to do both of the things that are being presented to you, but actually you can only do one. So it's producing this tension and this conflict. And they're a really nice tool because they allow us to tease apart different features. So magnitude and severity of harm, physical contact. So does harming someone involve touching them? Does it involve exerting personal force into the action? Depending on what action you do, who's going to benefit from your decision? Evitability or inevitability. So if you act, even if you didn't act, would someone be harmed? And then obviously intentionality comes into this as well. So they've been used for many years and before psychology in philosophy to tease apart these different moral principles. Now, for me particularly, I've been interested in the domain of morality of harm. So I'm interested in these more sort of extreme life and death decisions and understanding how people make those, like what kind of factors predict what they're going to do in those situations. And in order to do that, we use a very specific type of moral dilemma, which I'm sure you've all heard of. These are sacrificial moral dilemmas. I should say that this is an LLM generated image of the trolley problem, which I just think is fantastic. It's just nonsensical. It makes no sense, the picture. But obviously the most famous sacrificial moral dilemma is the trolley problem, which I'm sure many of you have heard of. But what I'll do is I'll talk you through examples of these trolley problems anyway. So when we talk about the trolley problem, we usually talk about two different versions or two sort of component parts of the trolley problem. There's the switch dilemma and there's the footbridge dilemma. So I'll present the switch dilemma to you first. Um, so imagine that you've got this kind of runaway trolley. We can make it a runaway train car because that's more modern and probably what people are used to seeing. So imagine there's a runaway train car and it's heading down some tracks and it's heading towards some construction workers. And you can see them on the right hand side of the track up ahead. Now, if it continues on its present course, it's going to hit and it's going to kill them. But you're standing next to this switch, which operates some points in the track. So what you could do is you could flick that switch, and what it will do, it will redivert this runaway train car down the neighboring track on the left-hand side instead, where there's only one person. So essentially, you're being asked to decide whether it's morally acceptable to sacrifice one life in order to save five lives. So if you were presented with a moral dilemma like this one, you'd be given this kind of text-based vignette to read, and then you'd be asked, is it morally acceptable to flip the switch? Now, what you typically get in these types of moral dilemmas is quite a high percentage of people saying, yes, it's morally acceptable to flick the switch, sacrificing one to save five. And in moral psychology, some researchers have called this kind of characteristically utilitarian. Insofar as you're making that decision, whether it captures the entirety of a utilitarian decision is something that we can definitely talk about in the Q&A. But let's call it characteristically utilitarian for now. But then you've got this other moral dilemma. So this is kind of the other half of the trolley problem. So this is the footbridge dilemma. So in this case, you've got really similar events playing out. The same runaway trolley train cars heading down the tracks towards these five people. The same thing's going to happen if you don't do anything. But this time, there's this kind of construction bridge over the scene, and you're standing on this bridge, and in front of you is a person wearing this really large, heavy hiking rucksack. So what you could do in this situation is you could push the person off the bridge, where the large bulk of them combined with this rucksack is going to fall onto the track below. And if the trolley or the train car hits that, it will derail. They'll die, of course, but you'll be saving the five people. So you're being presented with a similar kind of trade-off. But what you typically get, and hopefully this feels intuitive for you when you think about these cases, is a far lower rate of people saying that this is morally acceptable. So people are far more likely to say, no way, this is not morally acceptable, for various different reasons. And lots of different models have attempted to explain why you get these differences between the two cases, because structurally they're very similar, right? They have that 1 to 5 trade-off. And I'm not going to talk about all the different models. I'm going to focus on one because I want to come back to this later when I talk about virtual reality. So one very well known and popular model of decision making, of moral judgment, is the dual process model of moral judgment by Josh Green, or developed by Josh Green. And in this model, I mean, this is a simplified explanation, but this is the way that the differences in these two responses are explained. So in footbridge type responses, or in footbridge type dilemmas, when you read what's required of you in that situation, you get this kind of immediate aversive emotional response. And I would imagine some of you actually experienced that when I was explaining it to you. And it's that kind of immediate aversive emotional reaction that makes most people say, no way, it's not morally acceptable. But what you get in switch type cases instead is the absence of this strong emotional reaction, because this time you're just flicking a switch. And so the idea is that these more kind of controlled cognitive processes can drive the decision making. And that's why you get so many more people giving these kind of characteristically utilitarian responses. And again, we could talk lots about this model in the Q&A, but I want you to hold this model in your heads because I'm going to come back to it later. But at the time that I started doing research in this area, lots of people were focusing on these different models, these different cognitive models of moral judgment. But I actually became just super, super interested in the measurement. So the way that we were actually measuring these responses. So if you think about yourself as a participant coming to one of these experiments, you wouldn't even be presented with the diagrams that I just showed to you, right? You would be given a text-based vignette, which is on the slide right now. This is a version of the footbridge dilemma. And so you'd read it and then you'd respond to some questions. Is it morally acceptable? And some people use like-it type responses, other people use binary responses, yes or no. And that's used as a way of capturing your moral judgment about this case. And what's interesting is that around the time that I started my PhD, so it would have been about 2014, probably a little bit before that, researchers started to introduce these action choice questions as well. So, would you do it? And there was early evidence of this kind of action judgment discrepancy, whereby people were responding to the two questions differently. And then some psychologists were talking about how this, this was capturing this kind of difference between moral judgment and moral action. But for me, giving someone a text-based vignette that's fundamentally contextually impoverished, and then asking whether you would do something still feels very much like a judgment. And we know from everyday life and other areas of research that what people say and what people do are very different. So we display a lot of moral inconsistency. I mean, I certainly do. I think most people can recognize this in themselves. And we know from lots of other areas of research that moral inconsistency is prevalent and moral hypocrisy. But we face a number of challenges in this particular domain. So when we think about the domain of morality of harm, and I think the two main challenges, one is an ethical challenge and the other is a methodological challenge. So ethically, if I want to study someone's moral action, it would be completely inappropriate for me to expose people to these kinds of life and death situations. But methodologically, there's also a challenge because if we all, I don't know where everyone is sitting right now, but if we all got up now, left wherever we are and went to the nearest train station, we're probably not going to be witnessing things like the trolley problem, the footbridge dilemma, or the switch dilemma happening in real life. These extreme cases just are very uncommon. And that's really for me where these kind of simulated technologies slotted into the picture. So technologies like virtual reality, because you can simulate moral dilemmas experiences that can both look and feel realistic while protecting the welfare of participants. So that was really where virtual reality came into the picture for me. So what I'll do now is hopefully I've justified the role of VR now in this the picture of studying moral action. So what I'll do now is I'll zoom in on some different studies that I ran using different virtual reality technologies. So to start with, let's draw out some distinctions between a virtual reality moral dilemma and a text-based moral dilemma. So it sounds obvious, but it's worth highlighting these differences before I show you the results. So you'll see in the slides just screenshots of various moral dilemmas. So the footbridge dilemma and the switch dilemma are the very typical trolley type problems, but there are lots of different versions of these trolley type cases that all involve these trade-off, these sacrifices. And some of these images are from early versions, some are later versions. And obviously the image in the top is an earlier version of a footbridge dilemma. So these dilemmas have visual and auditory salience in a way that a text-based case doesn't. So you as an experimenter and as the developer, if you're also creating the scene, you are controlling everything about the soundscape in that scenario. So the environmental sounds, whether you choose for the avatars or the agents to cry out for help, all these kinds of things are within your control. Arguably, a text-based vignette probably also have some level of auditory salience, but it's driven by individuals' mental imagery, right? And you have less control over what that looks like. But you can also measure actions in the moment of decision making. So rather than relying on someone's reading speed as they look through a vignette, you're actually able to control the speed of, say, the train as it approaches these five people, the window in which you allow people to make a decision, and you can capture various different pieces of information as they make that decision. Okay. So let's look at some of the first experiments I ran. So in these early experiments, I simply wanted to look at whether actions in virtual reality moral dilemmas would be the same or different to moral judgments in the sort of traditional text-based vignettes. So what I'll do is I'll go right back to the beginning. So this is the very first study that I ran, and this was back in 2015, I think. Actually, it would have been 2014. And there were two groups. So the first group of participants read the text-based version of the footbridge dilemma. And then I asked them, is it morally acceptable to push the person off the footbridge? Would you do it? So I included both questions. We'll call them the text-based condition or the text-based group. The second group were then immersed in this virtual reality sort of reconstruction of the footbridge dilemma. And this was one of the first Oculus development headsets. So this was back when virtual reality technology didn't have things like hand tracking or didn't have controllers. So you'd have to program other devices to work with them. So in this first experiment, participants had to hold a joystick. So if they wanted to push the person off the footbridge, they push the joystick forward, or they'd completely omit a response. Let's call them the VR group. So I'll show you the results. So let's look at the text-based results first. So along the y-axis, you've got the percentage of responses. The dark bars are these characteristically utilitarian responses. So that's when, in the text condition, they've read the footbridge dilemma and they've said, yes, it's morally acceptable to push the person. Yes, I would do it. And you could see that the data aligns with what we would expect with these types of cases, particularly if you think about Green's dual process model of moral decision making. It's kind of personal, up close moral dilemma. So most people go, no way, I wouldn't do it. It's not morally acceptable. So that is what we would expect. What happened in virtual reality was quite different. So when people were immersed in VR, we had this complete flip pattern of responses. So then 70% of people decided to push the person off the footbridge in virtual reality. And this was a student sample. I was really surprised by this finding for reasons that I'll talk about in a minute. So the first thing I did was replicate this with the general public. And you can see that it was near enough the same. So you get this flip pattern of responses whereby people are more willing to sacrifice the person in the virtual simulation. Um, I then went on to do several different studies with different types of populations where I thought that, they might show different patterns of responses. And I'm happy to talk more about why in the Q&A afterwards. So you'll see that paramedic practitioners, so these are training paramedics on placement, they also have the same flip pattern of responses. And incident commanders working in the fire service also have the same flip pattern of responses. So incident commanders are the individuals who lead the team. So they go to the event and they decide who they are in charge of the triage process. They decide who's going to take risks and whether they should. So the same pattern was seen with them. But I wasn't totally satisfied or happy with any of these studies at the time. And part of the reason was because we were thinking about these personal up close moral dilemmas like the footbridge. And we were getting participants to hold this kind of joystick to make a decision. So we weren't accounting for things like personal force and physical contact, which actually play quite a significant and important role in these kinds of moral dilemmas. And so I really want to think about what other methods and technologies could be used to really capture those authentically in people's moral actions, or at least simulate those more authentically in some of these studies. So for this particular study, I worked with researchers in a robotics lab. And we decided to incorporate this massive device you can see in the slides. And this is called a V-bot, but it's basically a haptic virtual reality device. And the way that it works is like this. So you see, or you can either visualize in 2D or 3D an event or a set of sequences, and then you respond using this robotic arm. And the robotic arm can simulate physical resistance force. And that makes actions feel very realistic. So, for example, the V-bot can simulate, moving your arm through choppy water or smooth water. So these really like fine-grained sensory experiences. And so in the case of moral dilemmas, we're able to present a moral dilemma and then say it's the footbridge case. Participants, if they want to push the person off the footbridge, will push the robotic arm forward, and it will feel as though they're sort of pushing against a human that then sort of springs away from them if they push hard enough. And what was interesting about this particular study was that I didn't just want to rely on the footbridge case. I wanted to incorporate lots of different footbridge-like moral dilemmas so that we weren't just relying on one single moral dilemma. So in this study, we used 15 different personal footbridge type cases. And I'll show you the results. So exactly the same format, and it will be for all of the studies I show you today. So one group is responding to the original text-based moral dilemmas, the two questions like I showed you before. And now the other group is doing the same set of moral dilemmas, but this time they're responding using this haptic virtual reality device that makes the actions feel more realistic. And I'll show you the results. So remember, this time we're averaging across 15 different moral dilemmas, so not just the footbridge. But you'll see the pattern is still what we would expect for these types of cases. So with the traditional format and text, most people are saying, no, it's not morally acceptable to do this particular thing. No, I wouldn't do it. And if you break them down by moral dilemma, the pattern is the same across all of them. And you still see this very different pattern of responses when you incorporate haptic feedback that makes the actions feel more realistic. The difference is less extreme, but it's still statistically significantly different. And again, if you break it down by moral dilemma, it's not as though one or two dilemmas are driving the difference. You get this consistent difference across all 15, which is quite interesting. But I still wasn't totally happy. And that's because even though we now had haptic feedback, participants were still holding this kind of cold robotic handle. And I really wanted to think about this kind of personal force, physical contact, and the idea of corporeal sensation. So making contact physically with someone's body, because we know from research that it's important when it comes to moral behavior and moral action, particularly in this sort of domain of harm. So in this study, and this is really interdisciplinary, I worked closely with a sculptor, a speculative designer, to build an interactive sculpture that would essentially replace the joystick device in the virtual reality simulation. So it would allow kind of full bodily immersion. And I'll show you what this looked like. So this is essentially a large torso of a person. And the torso itself was made from platinum grade silicon with heated wiring underneath that was controlled to be the temperature of a human body with a t-shirt over the top. So if you closed your eyes and reached out and felt that, it really did feel like a human. And the idea is that this was synced to what was happening in virtual reality. So if someone pushed in the virtual reality footbridge, they would push forward, push this sculpture. If they pushed hard enough, it would fall forward, pass a set of springers along a runner, and then that would push the avatar in virtual reality. It was also weighted to the weight of someone this size. To give you a sense of what that meant, for me, I had to push with both hands and a lot of force to be successful in pushing that. So again, really similar experimental setup. So we had one group responding this time just to the text-based footbridge dilemma, one group now responding to the virtual simulated version of the footbridge dilemma, but now with this realistic sculpture to try and create this kind of full bodily immersive effect. I'll show you the text-based data first as before. So again, this is aligning with what we would expect and with all the previous studies. So most people, when they read the text-based case, they're saying, no, it's not morally acceptable. No, I wouldn't do it. And with the incorporation of the virtual sculpture, we still found this very big difference. So even when participants are immersed in virtual reality, but they have to make contact with this human-like body, and they have to actually exert quite a lot of their personal force to be successful in pushing them, they're still choosing to do that. And it's worth saying that we've replicated this many times now with lots of different modern virtual reality setups. So this is just an example when Oculus, now Meta, released the first sort of hand tracking abilities or capabilities in VR. So this is when, participants can actually see their own hands now. You still get that same pattern of results. So we've pretty much replicated the finding with every new piece of virtual reality or haptic technology that comes out. So what's actually happening then? How can we explain these findings? So if you go back to Josh Green's dual process of moral judgment, if I take all of the studies that we've run in our lab and I just take the traditional text-based vignettes, I take the traditional format, and I average all of the characteristically utilitarian responses, so utilitarian judgments. So this is an average combining all of those questions. Is it morally acceptable to do this particular thing? Would you do it? You get 20% of people saying yes. So that's a very low rate, and it can be explained by models like Josh Green's model, right? They're these emotional up close moral dilemmas. People go, no way. But if I take all of the different studies we've run using virtual reality and associated technologies, so haptic technologies as well, and I average the characteristically utilitarian simulated actions in those cases, you get 65%. And that's quite surprising because if you take models like Josh Green's model, you would actually expect even fewer utilitarian actions because not only is the case up close and personal, but virtual reality actually magnifies that effect. So virtual reality is very emotionally arousing. So I actually expected to see even fewer of these utilitarian type responses in virtual systems, and that didn't happen. So we've spent some time thinking about what's going on in virtual reality and studying or testing different models. And there's a couple of sort of theories. So one thing that might be going on is that virtual reality is changing what's driving decision making. So if you think about reading a text-based vignette, you're having to rely on your imagination to make that 1 to 5 trade-off. Whereas when you're in this kind of virtually simulated environment, you can see those people in front of you. And so it might be the thought of seeing them die and be killed or be harmed actually then becomes even stronger, or you assign even greater negative value to that than the act of actually pushing the person off the footbridge in the first place, or doing some other harm to an individual. It's quite hard to test that model. I'll happily talk more about how we've tried to do that afterwards. The other thing to think about is sort of perspective taking. So again, if you imagine yourself reading a text-based vignette, a lot of the time you're kind of using allocentric decision making or allocentric evaluations to guide your decision making. So you're thinking about the judgments of others and what might be better in the bigger picture sense. But when you're in virtual reality, you tend to get, especially if you experience high levels of presence, you tend to act in the interest of yourself. So a lot of the decision making is more egocentric. So that might also be explaining what's going on here. And it's also worth saying that we now have evidence across many different domains of this moral judgment action discrepancy. So other researchers have now replicated our findings in Europe and the US in lots of different types of virtual reality sacrificial dilemmas. And as recently as 2024 and 2023, so lots of people are kind of replicating this. But we also find the same thing with other types of virtual simulated dilemmas. So this is one study by Indra Patil where they looked at altruistic dilemmas instead. So they found that on paper, many people would say, oh, of course, I would definitely stop and help this trapped person in a burning building, even if it risks my own life. But in virtual reality, 70% of people actually chose to run away and not help. So you get this judgment action discrepancy in other cases. And then also in behavioral lab-based studies. So some work by Dries Boston, simulating kind of two boxes, one with 5 mice in, one with one mouse in, and people choosing who's going to get the electric shock. I'll talk more about that study afterwards if anyone's interested. But all of these are sort of more evidence of this judgment action discrepancy. And just to show you briefly, and I know I'm coming to the end of the presentation now, but one of the things that I was also interested in doing was just studying whether this was simply an effective mode of presentation. So rather than us actually capturing moral action and a true judgment action discrepancy, is it just that virtual reality is the reason why we see a difference? So I've been doing a series of studies to systematically check that. And the idea is that we basically go from text all the way to virtual reality, and we add a little bit of contextual information every time, and we see if there's a moment where the decision making changes or where we see a difference. So far, these studies have not shown that. So in two studies, we've looked at text versus dilemmas with images versus dilemmas with lots of images. And you'll see that there's no difference. It's the same, so we don't get this effective mode of presentation. In another set of studies, we decided to do text, image, and sound, text, image, sound, and moving image sequences like this one. So not quite video, just before video. And again, we don't see a difference. We even had a version where we had a joystick included as well, and we still don't get a difference. And then a series of studies where we've recorded 2D videos of virtual reality moral dilemmas and compared those to text-based moral dilemmas, and we still don't see a difference. So you'll see that there's this kind of consistent pattern of responses. So it doesn't look to be just an effective mode of presentation. It looks like there's something specific about virtual reality that is either allowing us to capture moral action authentically, or something to do with sort of presence, I suppose. And that's worth thinking about. Yeah, I think that's all I want to say about that. Right. So just to wrap up and give time for questions. So there's plenty of other things happening in this area, and I didn't get a chance to talk to you about games, but maybe I will in the Q&A. But just to give you a sense of some of the other things that I've been doing with virtual reality. So one thing that I've been doing is thinking about other ways that we might use these virtual simulations. So another pocket of my research is really interested in species prioritization, and sort of the judgment action discrepancy we have in the way that we treat animals. And in this virtual simulation, you probably can't see, but there's a bunny rabbit on the track. It becomes very easy to take a lot of these paradigms and actually just switch out the entity that's involved in them. And so we're doing a big project at the moment where we're exploring what that might look like and how valid and reliable it is. A couple of years ago, I had a British Academy Leave a Whom grant, and I used that to build some different types of virtual reality dilemmas that were more sort of authentic, more plausible. So we took the same kind of trolley type problems, but we made them. Or we constructed them in a familiar environment. So there's one, for example, that's in the London Underground, and it's sort of more hyper realistic in the way it looks. And the last project that I didn't have time to talk about but that's really interesting is thinking about expertise in virtual reality. So I'd already run a series of studies with helping professionals in VR, but more recently I've been doing some work with moral philosophers in virtual reality trolley problems, and we just finished collecting data for that project, and the findings are really interesting. But I will wrap up there and give plenty of time for questions. And just to thank my amazing lab and then all the wonderful people that work with me on these projects. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was really I've heard you present some of this before, but it doesn't get old. I really enjoyed that.
Oh,
Um,
thanks.
so I guess for questions, feel free to like just raise your hand or also to like pop questions into the Q&A box. If you can't find it, you can click on like the more dot 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 panel below, and find the Q&A box that way.
Thank you. Kathryn, I'm just going to stop recording here so students are more comfortable
Yeah, of
asking
course, no
questions.
problem.